So let's talk about the fundamentals now. And I'm going to leave dedicated time in the end for Q&A too, but keep in mind, ask questions at any point. If I get to a part and something doesn't make sense or I didn't explain something, please feel free to ask any questions you want. So we talked about some of the core components. So for the fundamentals area I'm going to go through now, we're going to go over structure of online things, design, content, interactivity, and social and third-party platforms. We're going to cover all of that. So when we talk about a structure, the structure of your site or your online information, we're talking about basically the content management system is the first place to look at. Some content management systems are actually really poor at accessibility, and they just don't even support some of the things you may want to do to ensure really good accessibility. Now, if you're all on WordPress, don't worry about it because WordPress is really phenomenal and most of them are okay. But that's the first thing to consider is you don't want to be hindered by your content management system. It just may not have, what you need to ensure accessibility. And then keep in mind too, the third-party platforms that may come with that. And then there's sort of some global website-wide attributes that are part of the structure. So that's defining what's called the viewport, which is how much space the information should take on a screen, defining the language, defining the major sections. What is a navigation section? What is a content section? What is a header section, a footer section? There's all this coding now that defines sections in your site. And these accessibility tools really leverage that because as a person goes through your website page after page, they don't necessarily want their tool to read out the navigation every time. They may want to just load a new page and start with the content, right? Because they already have an idea what your links are. So those are these global structural things. So, and the navigation is really important. The navigation and how you can navigate through your site, use links, use forms, use buttons, calls to action. There's best practices for all of that. And that's very important. That's kind of what we think about as the overarching structure. So now on something like a social media platform, you can't really control that, right? You're really just putting content up there. And third-party tools, if you have a donation platform, something else, you also might not be able to control a lot of that. But on your own website, you can control the structure. That's just an example. This is an Animal Humane website, and one of the tools we use that's very handy, a couple tools. One of the first picture is Andy, which is an accessibility tool actually created and put out by the government itself, US government. And the other one is Wave, and Wave is the primary tool I use. And both of these tools, I'm just looking at the structure. And on the right-hand side, I've turned off all design elements so I can visually see how the structure and the hierarchy of the site is, right? The hierarchy of your code is actually really important because much like a search engine crawling bot or something, which doesn't see your website, it just ingests all of the code and interprets it. That's the same way how accessibility tools work. So making use of best practices for your coding and best practices in your navigation, your site hierarchy is incredibly important. The next major area is really design. Okay, and that's having enough color and contrast to meet minimum standards. There's a minimum sort of standard for what contrast has to happen for people to understand text and different things. Minimum sizes for text too. Also font choices and how fonts are aligned. And there's a lot of cognitive differences that fall into the realm of accessibility. And some people have a very hard time, for instance, with centered text. A big block of centered text, their mind has a really hard time processing that. So it's general best practice to left align all your text. Using fonts where the letters connect, maybe a cursive or a script or something where letters are connecting, causes issues a lot of times for people with different cognitive abilities. And then buttons and icons and different design cues. And I'll talk about this more. Some things are exempt. For instance, your logo or any design element, which is sort of just extra that isn't critical to the understanding of your content or function of your site, is technically exempt from accessibility. I would say make it accessible anyways, right? It's all about inclusion. I don't want to have two dramatically different experiences for my website for different people. I want everyone to enjoy, understand, and consume all of our, the content in the same way, if possible. And this is an area nonprofits struggle with the most. The most is with design. And we find this typically because, nonprofits typically have fairly soft color palettes. They're not super high contrasty, sort of the official brand colors, maybe quite light, which can cause some issues. So in designing for accessibility, we see ourselves a lot of times using brand colors as accents, maybe not necessarily the major colors used. Just another example from Wave. Here's a site, a major nonprofit, and just running a test on one of their pages, there was 37 contrast errors. So that is this tool saying this piece of text or doesn't match what the minimum requirements are. So, and kind of the work that we typically do. So we have sort of a standard accessibility audit product you can buy from us, which is basically consulting. It's a consulting product, and our report always includes this list of your brand colors, and we test them. So you can see this is a picture, just one page from one of our reports. And we go through all of the brand colors they have in their brand guide, and they basically all fail. All fail the contrast test, except for the very dark blue one. So that's something we always look at. You should consider that too. Actually, our own brand guide has accessibility baked into the brand guide and talks specifically about where you can use different color combinations and how those work. So I'm going to switch this poll here. Thank you for answering. So the next poll here is kind of about funding. So that's design. Now let's talk about content. What is accessible content really? So content, we're talking about not just text and pictures and things, but buttons, links, and any sort of calls to action. These things need descriptions. So a perfect example is, a lot of times you see on a website a link that says click here. And if you are consuming the website on a normal computer, mouse, keyboard, and you're scrolling through, you may be able to understand that because of the content around it. But a very typical way someone with a disability will use a website is they will, in their accessibility tool, hit a thing that just says, read me all the links in this page, read all the links so I can know where I want to go next. Well, if you hear a link read out and it says, click here, that's pretty useless. Learn more, click here, what all these sorts of like link text, which you see pretty common, that's poor accessibility standards. Because if you just hear that, you won't know what that means. So that's an example. And of course, alt text for images. Anything that's visual, a video, an image, anything like that, it needs to be described and supported with text as well. So that's the alt text, the special coding that goes in your image. And then closed captioning for multimedia, of course, for video. Also PDFs. In general, you really should avoid any external file types. And if you do absolutely have to have an external file type on your website, say you have a link to download your annual report or what have you, there are actual ways to make PDFs accessible. So if you have to have a third party sort of file on your site that's not a web page, the PDFs are the most recommended. And the Adobe Acrobat tool itself has a accessibility checker in it. So before you publish any PDFs, make sure whoever's designing them or creating them does check them and run that tool for accessibility. In general, though, avoid external files, because what will happen is, on a iPhone or a special device for accessibility, that's going to hit that file download and it may or may not work. It may have to open another application. It's just kind of complicated. So it looks like the vast majority are not sure if any of your funding it has accessibility requirements. So definitely check into that. It is becoming a very common thing. And for sure, hands down, if you get any money from the federal government, state government, local government, that probably in the fine print has something that says something about accessibility. So here's an example of that. So that alt text I was talking about, that alt text. So here's a picture from a major nonprofit, and you can see they do a pretty good job. The little green text under that photo of the dog and the woman says, "Woman on couch with dog and coffee." Pretty good. Now you'll notice, here's a tip. You'll notice that alt text does not start with image of or photo of, because what actually happens with many accessibility tools, if someone uses the function to say, hey, tell me about the graphics on this page, those tools will say an image of or a photo of. So you don't need to put that in your alt text. Otherwise, the device will read out a photo of woman on a couch, blah, blah, blah. It's just redundant. So you don't need to include that in your alt text. And we have a guide on writing alt text, and that's actually going to be included in the follow-up email. And then this is some closed captioning for a client of mine. And closed captioning is really easy to do. And of course, many major platforms, for instance, like YouTube, it will just do it automatically. And even if you have not touched it or turned that option on, Facebook, YouTube, they are doing automatic, even Instagram, they are doing automatic captions for things, pictures and video. Although they could be pretty poor, if your audio isn't great, those closed captions could be way off. So this is a picture of YouTube's tool, which is actually really phenomenal. What we recommend clients do is load up your YouTube videos, turn on automatic captions, go into the caption manager and just correct the mistakes. And so it takes very little time, actually, especially with professionally done video. The audio is very clear. So it's pretty easy to do. So don't skip that. Don't skip captioning things. Let's switch the poll again, actually, here real quick. I think I have one about audits. So functionality. Now, when we're talking about functionality, that's a major component of accessibility. And we see the most issues usually with forms. And forms are critical, like if a donate form, contact form, sign up for a program form, sign up for your email newsletter, what have you. Those forms and the buttons and the form controls in them, they need to be accessible. That means having field labels. And when you have fields that go together, like checkboxes, radio buttons, you need form field sets. And you also need to make sure you have what's called the focus. And this is actually a thing that I've seen even on some major websites where what's called focus is not done properly. And that has to do with going through a site without a mouse, without a mouse, being able to use a keyboard and tab through elements. And so basically, that's a major tenet of sort of accessibility systems, is they basically send keyboard commands to your website. And I'll talk about that when we get into testing. An easy way to test functionality is to load up your website and don't touch your mouse, just use your keyboard and see if you can use your site. So pop-ups, chat bots, other features that are sort of interactive, those can cause a ton of accessibility issues. So you need to test those, make sure that, your support chat or anything is accessible. And site search too. We see big issues with search. A lot of times their website's pretty good, but they never test the search. Can the search be used with just a keyboard? Are the results formatted in an accessible way? And then e-commerce, right? You want to be able to either sell things or collect donations or whatever. So really testing that interaction, the data input's importance. Pop-ups we see pop-ups and things that slide in cause a lot of issues, because the page changes and focus may be broken. So that's something to consider. Here's another picture. So this has two forms on it, and there's a search lost pet form. Now this is just a great demonstration too of how complex accessibility can be. So that form is okay. You see the little green tag, that's an indication of a form label. So that form has the correct label. The button has not the greatest text. It's a search. I don't know why it says apply. But you'll see there's a contrast error on that button. So the blue and the white, it's not enough contrast. Now, the other form on this page is actually a search form way up in the upper right-hand corner. That form has a big issue. The magnifying glass, which makes sense to someone with vision, search, right? Magnifying glass, you can click on it. That link to open their search has no description of it. There's no text description behind that. Someone using a screen reader would not even know likely that there is a search on this site. So that's a major oversight. And when it comes to interactivity too, you just really want to be wary of form builders or external tools or whatever external tool. Test those tools. People sometimes miss that. And then you want to avoid as much as possible things like iframes or including things in the site from an external source. That's difficult for accessibility tools to use and track the focus throughout the site when there's a lot of external things included. So those are things to really look at. So have you done an audit? It looks like about 25% of you have done an audit. And about 25% of you, it seems like you plan on it. So that's good. Um, and by audits, I don't mean necessarily just buying a tool. I mean working with an actual consultant. I should have been more clear on that question. Now, when we get into a lot of interactivity, there's one other part of accessibility which you may or may not need, and it's called ARIA. So ARIA is only supported in the latest version of HTML or our later version. I think it's HTML5. So HTML is kind of the language that builds websites and displays them into your browser, and there's different versions. So they added something called ARIA, and ARIA is mostly for web applications. It's for complicated interactivity. It does add some special compatibility for certain devices. It's for advanced kind of interactive forms and systems. And in general, you can avoid this. Most of the time, most clients don't need ARIA. And you can learn more. There's going to be a link to learn more about ARIA if you want in the follow-up email. But you need to carefully consider whether you decide to use this ARIA technology or not, because like I said, it's only supported in the latest HTML. There are a lot of popular accessibility devices that rely on older versions of HTML. And so they may not get the form controls and understand ARIA. So that's something that's a little bit more of a technical thing, but it's something that's important to consider. Let's talk a little bit about social media, because really this webinar is online accessibility. That means everything: your third-party systems, your file downloads, your website, your social media, your YouTube, everything, right? So social media now, they lagged behind really having good accessibility, and they got in big trouble for it, right? Facebook and a lot of companies got in trouble for poor accessibility. So lately, in the last few years, they've made a lot of improvements. So my top advice for social media is, for sure, leverage all the features they allow you to use. If any accessibility feature they have, whether it's closed caption or adding alt text, leverage all those features. And a lot of people don't realize this, but you can add alt text to your Instagram posts. You can add alt text to your Facebook posts. You can add alt text in a lot of areas that people maybe don't think about. And if you don't do it yourself, these social media platforms now are going to just guess what your picture is and put in text. And the text maybe not. So this is a little picture just of my own Instagram, right? And I put a picture of my cat up there. It's a bit hard to read, but it's my personal Instagram, so I'm not really investing in accessibility. It's just personal. But what Instagram put for the alt text for that picture is a picture by Nicholas Longton may be a picture of a cat. So it actually can tell it's a picture of a cat, but that's not super useful. If I really wanted to make this picture accessible, I would manually put in the alt text and describe the cat stuff. So there's going to be a guide on social media accessibility coming in this email as well, so you can learn more about that. Also, when you're talking about campaigns, just in general, you're going to launch a social media capital campaign to raise money to build a building or this or that, or give to the max, or you're doing some kind of social campaign. I've seen a lot of whole campaigns where they just are not accessible. Like the whole campaign is these short video clips of something happening, and there's no closed captioning, or there's no extra text. There's nothing to support that media. So when you're actually planning a campaign from the get-go, bake in accessibility into your social media campaigns.